Hello, welcome back to the My Football Writer channel. We are doing a little four-parter called The Review, where we're going to look back on Norwich City's season. I'm joined by BBC Radio Norfolk's Chris Goreham, Chris, and EFL Vlogger, and probably Norfolk's favourite Ipswich fan, Mr. Benjamin Bloom.
We said we weren't going to mention that,
Sorry.
didn't we?
Get it in early and then they'll forget about it.
They'll forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. How are you?
I'm lovely. I'm very tired from the playoffs this week, but we've made it and we're going to talk about your glorious season, yes?
I was going to mention that. Chris, how nice is it to watch the playoffs without being involved in them?
Yeah, it's great. I think after Wembley, when we won there in 2015, everybody said that winning at Wembley is the best way to go up. But I don't agree with that anymore. Having had this season where Norwich have won the league and enjoyed it and then been able to sit back and watch everybody else go through the torture of the playoffs, I'm all for winning the league. It may be more boring, but for me, if you win the league, there's no doubt about it, that's the way to go up. I've said recently, it's the difference between being a self-made millionaire and a lottery winner. You get the money either way, but it's much more satisfying to do it the hard way and go up and win the league. If you do it in the playoff final, all the time you just feel as if you're a refereeing decision or a goalkeeping error or a defensive error away from just it all going wrong. So I'll take winning the league every time.
Absolutely. How are you? A bit tired? You've obviously been following the playoffs quite closely.
But I think I saw a classic Shakespearean tragedy at Leeds on Wednesday night. Looking forward to the final, and I'm not even going to say.
You're not going to put your money on anyone yet?
I don't think so. After seeing that, look, we're not going to get a game like we got with Leeds again, because Leeds were the only team that would fall for that type of tactics from Lampard, as in just put all your dribblers on and run at the centre halves. But should be a good fun. You'd make Villa favourites, wouldn't you?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's nice to be here, nice and relaxed without worrying about the playoffs, I'll be honest. But we are going to take a look back at Norwich City's season, one which of course ended them as champions in the division. Perhaps no one saw that coming at the start, but we are going to start probably last May and a 5-1 defeat at Hillsborough to Sheffield Wednesday. Chris, you were there.
I was, yeah.
Just how negative was the mood around the club at that point?
Well, when I agreed to come on looking back at our title triumph, I didn't think we were going to be starting with that sort of mood.
We can only go up.
You're right. I think this all lends into the context of how unexpected the achievement was this season, because Norwich lost 5-1 at Hillsborough on the last day of last season. James Maddison had got injured, and even with the concerns about his fitness, I think the players had about an hour or so of that game to show us what life would be like without James Maddison. And it was awful. They lost 5-1. I think you have to remember they'd lost 4-1 at QPR a few weeks before as well. And I think I'm right in saying that even after the first 6 matches of this season, Norwich had a run of something like 3 wins in something like 20, 21 league games. And that's one of the reasons why there were questions about Daniel Farke's future, because it wasn't just they'd started this season poorly, it was they'd finished last season badly as well. And I know there were extenuating circumstances and players had to leave and there was a big churn in the summer, but quite often football supporters don't really see past results, and when they're that poor for that long, fans of most clubs I think would have been worried and would have had questions to ask.
And you were there at that day at Hillsborough. I wasn't. I think by that point I'd done Sunderland in midweek and thought that's my lot now. Yeah. So which I'm sure most people will understand. Just how poor were Norwich on that day, and how surprised are you looking back, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, that we're in this position now where Norwich have won the league, given the position they were in? Certainly
you would never have sat at Hillsborough and said, it's all right, we'll win the league next season. You would have been, I don't know what would have happened to you, but you wouldn't have made it home safely, there's no doubt. But I think it's also, there was the slight bit of sunlight that it was the last day of the season, and ridiculous things do happen on the last day of the season. The game didn't really mean anything to either side. Yeah, we'd lost 5-1, it's never nice losing 5-1, but it was a game that didn't matter. So it was quite easily brushed off, I think, and I think we were just relieved to get to the end of the season, because you finish 14th. Norwich are a club over the last 10-15 years that have been used to having either promotion or relegation to battle for right until the end. So a mid-table season didn't feel great. It felt quite boring by the end of the season. So I think we were pleased to get that one out of the way, and actually there was more interest by then about what would happen in the summer. We knew Maddison was going to go, we knew there would be more departures, and I think by then the attention had already turned to what are we going to do next.
And from you, obviously, you've seen a lot of the EFL probably over the last few years. What did you make of that Norwich side under Daniel Farke's first season? Because it was built up mainly of James Maddison, but also of a few integral loans, Angus Gunn, Harrison Reed. Seeing that result, how worried were you for Norwich?
I mean, you have to trace it back. under Alex Neil, it was a massive failure because that was a £55 million wage bill at the time, the second highest ever reported wage bill that didn't get them promoted. They then bring Farke in and kind of cut the cloth accordingly. There were some signs at the start of the season. There was a run of away wins, weren't there? And then he kind of deviated. He went 3-5-2, and then you realised. And I came to a game here against Brentford, and I came to a game here against Fulham where there was Pritchard and there was Maddison, and they both seemed to be trying to do the same job. And then, frankly, one exceptionally good player carried the team through for the rest of the season. And from the outside, it looked like Norwich was stuffed. There was only 2 parachute payments this time because they'd only been up in the Premier League for 1 year. They were going to be gone. We wondered whether Stuart Webber was the Emperor's new clothes. Surely he can't do 2 unlikely promotions. And then we knew that Maddison was going to be going. And this is a team that's finished 14th, and you're removing the best player, seemingly possibly a best player with a huge influence on the team. From the outside, I thought 14th downwards.
Well, I think I don't want to keep bringing it back to Ipswich because you're here, Ben, but I think that day is because Connor's brought it up. Let's not forget Norwich and Ipswich both finished level on points.
12th, 13th, and 14th. Yeah, Norwich, Ipswich, and Leeds.
Incredible, but Ipswich finished above us on goal difference. Fair play, they deserved it that season. But you look at what happened after that. Both clubs actually had quite similar summers. They both sold their top 3 goal scorers. Well, if you include Nelson Oliveira, they both got rid of their top 3 goal scorers. And it shows you, if you don't get that recruitment right, how easily it can go the other way.
And the difference, Chris, is that the Norwich plan, you can wind back 15 months beforehand, had already started, and the Ipswich plan was thrown up in the air.
But I think it's just interesting now looking back how they were, Norwich and Ipswich were, at the end of last season, points terms, league standing terms, pretty much on an even keel. And it shows how it can go, it shows how important it is to get things right off the pitch. And we spend so much time worrying about formations and things on the pitch, but there's so much more to making a successful championship team. And a lot of it we don't see.
Agreed.
Absolutely. You used the word there, I think you were talking about Murphy and Maddison taking up the same positions. That first year under Daniel Farke probably felt very disjointed, didn't it, in terms of how the team played and how they operated as a whole.
It was Pritchard I was talking about, but I remember the Fulham game here, and Fulham were great, weren't they, that season? Really, and I remember watching that and just thinking that Norwich were sort of leagues behind them. And I remember in the East Anglian derby, the one with the 2 goals right at the end, that it was 2-3-5-2s. And it was basically, can we get the ball to Maddison? That seemed to be, I know we've seen a wonderful strategy and pattern of play emerge this year, but that was not there from my eye test last year. But sometimes these things, the work is done and the fruits come months and months after. Say in TV, you make a good TV show for a year, the ratings will come later. And I think we're going to give Farke a lot of credit through this, but this pattern of play, he's worked and worked and worked and worked at this. This hasn't just been a good pre-season, so we don't know what happens on the training ground, but obviously that pattern was already starting last season.
Yeah, the actual game plan, the actual tactics, the formation, bar 1 or 2 subtle adjustments, has been fairly consistent all the way through. His approach and the way he's wanted to play football actually hasn't changed from 14th in the Championship to top of the table. So I think you have to give him a huge amount of credit for how he has stuck to what he wanted to do, despite the criticism that it got, despite the fact that they did go a long time without winning matches. I think there were 1 or 2 games we saw in that first season where, Chelsea in the Cup was one. I remember they had a really good game at Derby in the league where it finished 1-1 and that they should have won it comfortably. And I think Curtis Davis went on social media afterwards, the Derby defender, and talked about that being one of the most difficult games he'd ever had at that level and how they really struggled to cope with Norwich. And you saw signs of it in some games and you thought, here we go. And they never quite went. It would then be followed up by a 4-1 at QPR or a 5-1 at Sheffield Wednesday. But this year, they scored more goals, they were far more consistent. And maybe you're right, maybe the seed was sown during last season.
Can I just ask Chris a question? Do you subscribe to the opinion that having one exceptional player, even though you'd always want Maddison in your team, actually unbalances it sometimes?
I think you see signs of that, don't you, sometimes? When you look at the Champions League recently where Tottenham got an amazing result without Harry Kane and Liverpool didn't have Salah or Firmino and still managed to turn it around against Barcelona. So it's a strange argument because you would still, and Daniel Farke was asked this the other week about whether losing James Maddison was a blessing in disguise, and he answered it quite categorically and said, no, if we'd had James Maddison this season, we'd have been champions by March. So it's a good answer, and I can see what you're saying. I think when you lose a star man, someone who's obviously your best player, actually others then have to step up. They can't simply give the ball to Maddison, and that probably has happened this season. But you're never going to turn down the opportunity to have someone like that in your team. No. So it's if he'd somehow stayed with Norwich, he'd have played every game last season as well.
I've got it written down on my sheet here that Maddison and Josh Murphy scored a collective of 42 goals. So to take that out of any championship side, I think many would see as quite catastrophic in the summer. What were your thoughts on the recruitment in terms of how Norwich went about it? Because obviously it wasn't.
I'd never heard of any of the players.
But is that? I mean, you said the sort of seed was sown, if you like. Is that something that perhaps you expected not to hear of those players, and perhaps Norwich to go under the radar a little bit, or was it a case of you sort of thinking that Norwich were going to consolidate their position without Maddison and Murphy?
With hindsight, the recruitment was utterly brilliant, wasn't it? But at the time, who is Pookie? Who is Buendia? And it's this whole Moneyball, undervalued players that have been in Dortmund and in Spain and wherever, and then have sunk down, and you're going to regenerate them. I don't want to use the word gamble, because that type of signing is risk, a gamble, perhaps. And it's a risk. It's a very calculated risk, because you have to do the research on the players immediately. But there was no evidence that any of those players would perform at championship level, and God have they.
Well, I mean, we had an interview with Kieran Scott, and he was talking about Emi Buendia in particular. Said there was a million reasons not to sign Emi Buendia, but they still went forward and did it. Does that show perhaps the difference to Norwich compared to championship clubs in terms of recruitment, the fact they are willing to take those risks?
Well, compare Norwich to Stoke, and I'm going to babble a lot about parachute payments in this. What did Stoke spend in the summer?
A lot. And
this is the problem. Before I start ranting about this, when you get if a Premier League team signs a championship player, they spend 12, 15 million on them, and in the end, it's going to break the division. I know Bolton have just survived, but if this persists, someone is going to get liquidated. And I like what Norwich and Sheffield United have done, because they haven't done that. Okay, Norwich set up with 2 years of parachute payments, but I don't see Tom Ince for 12 million or Benik Afobe for 10 million, or Aston Villa's 88 million in one transfer window. So, no, hugely impressed with hindsight, but at the time, and I'm sure you as Norwich fans and as a Norwich expert will admit, who are these guys? There's no evidence that this is going to go well.
Well, yeah, this is what I was going to come on to, Chris, because as Norwich fans, I think we were all looking and going, who?
It's so difficult when you are employed by a radio station to be their Norwich City reporter, and then news comes in, they've signed someone, and they throw you in the studio and say, so, Emi Buendia, and you go, because you haven't got the knowledge base. You know, we are, I think probably English football fans have always been quite centric to what's going on in their country, and we've never been that open to what's going on elsewhere. But some of these players, I think it was difficult to have an opinion on. You couldn't be critical, you couldn't be excited, because you just didn't know. But while the recruitment has been rightly praised, I also think that Daniel Farke is probably the man, but Stuart Webber as well, the way they have adapted within that when situations have come up during the season. Because you look at that business in the summer, Ben Marshall started the season at right back. They signed Felix Paslak as well, another right back, and they had Ivo Pinto at the club. They had 3 right backs.
And Reed was playing right back at the end of last season as well.
They had 3 right backs, none of whom are Max Aarons. And yet Max Aarons emerged, did much better than I think anyone anticipated. And they didn't go, actually, look, we've got Marshall, we've got Paslak, we need to give them a go. They said, no, actually, Aarons is doing better than anybody else. He keeps his place. It means Marshall's going to have to go out on loan to Millwall, and Paslak didn't start a league game. You know, signings last summer that didn't work, but they didn't work because Norwich City gave Max Aarons a chance. And I think that was as impressive as the recruitment, the way that, yes, they had a plan at the start of the season, but they adapted within it.
You've spoken about Ben Marshall briefly there, and also I think Jordan Rose is another one. Those players with championship experience that we've not seen too much of.
Well, those were the ones you were going on the radio and saying, I am excited about those.
Yeah, I stand corrected. Sorry, there is evidence that Jordan Rose can score goals at the champ. And I would love to see that deal. I don't know what the loan fee was, or the promotion bonus, or the goal fee, but and this is just one issue I've got with Norwich fans. This hasn't been done for zero money. This has not been done for zero money. It's been built on parachute money and then done with brilliant recruitment. But Jordan Rose was not free.
Of Madison and Murphy have contributed to that equally.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, with Madison though, how many Championship clubs can afford to take someone for $2.5 million and just loan him out for a year? That would be a transfer record for Millwall and for Rotherham, teams that you're up against. But it's outstanding recruitment though, but not for free.
Let's speak about that opening day 2-2 draw with Birmingham there. As you said, Ben Marshall was at right back. I've got down here a hint of what was to come. I think I mean that in terms of the late drama that we saw that was so prevalent throughout the season.
I think whenever you have a first game of the season, there's always excitement and there's always nerves as well, because I've sat on the opening day of the season and watched Norwich get absolutely annihilated 5-0 at Fulham, and you're sitting in the back of your seat going, oh, this is going to be a long, hard season. You just want something on the first day of the season to get your teeth into. And when your team comes back from behind twice and scores a last-minute equaliser, you do go home thinking, okay, it's only a draw, but you go home thinking, I think we might be all right this season. There's something there for me to get my teeth into. This isn't going to be a complete disaster.
And when you saw that lineup, I think Pookie was on the left wing or in the number 10, and Jordan Rhodes was up front. And Ben Marshall was
Connor, Husband, Closer, Hanley, Marshall. None of them are going to finish the season in the back four.
Incredible.
And that speaks to what Chris has said, is this development during the season up to this game against Millwall you can literally see the pieces. I'm not going to say fall into place as a negative way, but you can literally see the pieces fall in and Daniel Farke go, it's not going to be Jordan Rhodes that's going to score the goals to get me promoted. It's not going to be Ivo Pinto at right back, or Ben Marshall, or even 9.9 million Tim Closer is going to get bombed out for a youth guy. Incredible.
Yeah. And I've seen many managers, not just at Norwich, but clubs up and down the country, who have, maybe not their favourites, but they're tried and tested. And you know that as soon as senior player A is fit again, he comes back in, regardless of how well anyone else has been doing. And that has been one of the real standout things from Norwich this season. They've reacted and watched what's happened on the pitch in front of them, and often rewarded players with what they deserve. And
then we go back to Carrow Road. We've got West Brom on the first home game of the season. Actually lost the game, what was it, 4-3 in the end, and it was one that perhaps you describe as a bit more entertaining, which fans wanted at that time, but ultimately they lost the game. So what was the feeling like around then?
I think football fans are funny, aren't they? And we're all the same, because when you're watching lots of 0-0 draws or 1-0, you cry out to be entertained, and then your team loses 4-3 and you're not happy with that either, because you're letting in lots of goals and missing penalties as well. I think with hindsight, you now accept that game and think, I could see what was happening. That was work in progress and it was necessary to get where we got. But at the time, it's frustrating because Norwich should have won that game. They had so many chances. They missed a penalty. They gave away some silly goals, and you could take heart from the fact that they played one of the promotion favourites, West Brom, and came away thinking we should have beaten them. But at the same time, you were slightly dismayed and slightly worried that they played quite well in the game and had still let in 4 goals. So I think it was a real test as to whether you were half empty or half full that game.
I think Stuart Webber described that West Brom game, even now, as one of Norwich's best performances of the season. What did you make of the two contrasting teams in that one?
I think we learned a lot about West Brom as well, didn't we? Because, as Chris said, if you look at the underlying stats of that game, Norwich probably should have won. And this is what West Brom did all season. They've got some very, very good players, not much strategy, and that carries them through. But no, Rhodes started up front, missed a penalty, and we saw the kind of short story of the Jordan Rhodes experiment is not going to work here, is it?
I think that's probably most pertinent in that Ipswich game, in the first East Anglian derby of the season, where he was so isolated and so out there by himself pretty much compared to the rest of the team, that we saw elements that actually perhaps Jordan Rhodes isn't going to fit into Norwich's style of what they wanted to do.
No, and when you knew what was waiting literally in the wings, that's going to transpire.
I think I've heard you describe that Ipswich game as like the sliding doors moment for both sides. Absolutely insane.
I mean, so from a Norwich point of view, it's the debut of Buendia, who turns out, along with Grealish and Hernandez, to actually be probably one of the 3 best players in the whole league. I don't know where that came from. He wasn't actually very good against Ipswich. He wasn't ready, and he got kind of hustled out of it. Aarons makes his debut, so you now have this. And when we talk about Norwich, you've just got to talk about balance. And you start to see these 2 guys who can receive the ball at fullback, go out with pace up and down. And you start to see what he's going to do with the 3 off the front. Rhodes did stink it out at Ipswich, didn't it? And Pookie, I thought Pookie played well, actually. He was playing 10.
And then he went to a left wing sort of later on, didn't he?
Well, he just moved around and used as and how. And this was the game where Norwich started to find what they were going to do. And I know we're not here to talk about Ipswich, but Ipswich threw it all up in the air, played very direct, brought John Walters in on loan, started 3 lone guys, bombed the keeper out, and but look at the stats, Ipswich should have won that game.
Yeah, well, I will use another word that I think sums up Norwich and Daniel Farke, and that not just balance but bravery. I think giving Max Aarons his first league start in an East Anglian derby at Portman Road, what a call that is.
And the back four finished with Godfrey in it as well.
He played the entire second half. A couple of massive calls there from Daniel Farke. And again, I don't know many managers, head coaches who would have done that. You know, I just don't. And you mentioned the game against Brentford last season where actually the crowd was starting to turn a little bit and Daniel Farke was getting pressure. That's the game that he gave Jamal Lewis his debut.
Is it?
So yeah,
there you go.
So to actually, in those circumstances, again, most championship managers, most managers probably would go, this is one for tried and tested.
And also,
and he doesn't. He says, do you know what? I trust Max Aarons, I trust Jamal Lewis. We're struggling at the minute. Things aren't going great, but I'm going to give him a chance.
And it's interesting that you say that. I did an interview with David Johnson, the ex-Ipswich striker, and he said the madness of not dripping new players in. You just mentioned it. So Lewis was actually coming in last year. Leitner had already come on loan. Hernandez, and they one at a time. Aarons, Godfrey, you know, even Cantwell doesn't end up being so important, but he did it one at a time as well, which, again, with hindsight and probably with foresight, is a very sensible way to build a football team.
But I just think that faith in youth, and when we got the team sheet, and I know Max Aarons had scored against Cardiff in the Cup the previous midweek, and we thought, oh, he looks a promising lad. But when the team sheet landed and he's on it, we were...
And what do you think John Walters would have done? Right, where's this 5 foot... I'm going to beat up on him all game and we're going to target him, but...
And what a call from Daniel Farke. Yeah, he deserves whatever luck, whatever you want to call it. He deserves the success he's had this season, Daniel Farke, for making calls like that.
Absolutely. If I rewind, I was in the away end at Portman Road, and I remember the fairly audible chants of Farke sorted it out. It was getting a bit ugly. He then proceeded to bring on Louis Thompson, I think, at that point, which wasn't too greatly received at the time. But if we look at it, there was a real spell, particularly sort of early second half, where Ipswich dominated.
Yes.
And had they have scored a second goal, how different it could have panned out for Norwich.
I can't remember off the top of my head how many minutes Ipswich were in front for in that game. But in that spell of 15, 20 minutes, whatever it was, Ipswich were actually above Norwich in the as it stands table. That's how ridiculous. You're shaking your head.
We hadn't won a game
now.
either.
It seems ridiculous. At that point, while they were leading 1-0, the table in front of you, Ipswich were above Norwich. And I remember coming away from that game thinking, wasn't in terms of quality, that's one of the poorest East Anglian derbies I've seen. Yeah. These two sides are going to be...
You can clip me on my YouTube video saying both sides will probably finish in the bottom 8.
Yeah.
I said
I think
at that
I probably
time.
was saying the same.
Yeah.
But again, if you leave that ground and tell the people inside it, there'll be 60 points between these teams at the end of the season. You would not have believed it, would you? And that's why trying to analyse football is just a ridiculous business sometimes.
When we talk about seasons, we often talk about moments and we talk about games as being changing points. In terms of Norwich's season, how big was that goal from Mo Leitner?
Well, yeah, for all the reasons we've just said. I think they had, in 3 successive games, I think they had 3 big moments. There was the win at Cardiff in the League Cup, which didn't feel like a particularly massive deal at the time. We were pleased we'd beaten a Premier League team, but Max Aarons played, Stiepermann to the fore, and a lot of those players then, the Carling Cup team, or the League Cup team, I should say, then became the league team for a lot of the time, which was interesting. The next game, that equaliser from Leitner, and then the game after that, which I know we're going to talk about, when they were 1-0 up against Middlesbrough, and Tim Closer got sent off, and then the referee changed his mind. 3 games, 3 big moments that, I don't know, that all seemed to come together to be pivotal in what happened with Norwich.
I know you said we wouldn't speak about Ipswich too much, and I don't want to dwell on them too much for your sake more than anything else. But if we look back to that game and we compare the respective plans of the two clubs,
there's no plan at Ipswich.
Well, there was at the time, which was trying to buy young, hungry players, and then they buy John Walters on loan, you know, and it's that sort of.
They dropped the goalkeeper 3 times Player of the Year 1 hour before the game. I bet you saw that come through on your and thought, what is going on here?
I get on very well with Brennan, my opposite number at Radio Suffolk, and we were comparing team news before the game, and he was saying, I can't believe they've dropped Bart, and I was saying, I can't believe they're playing Aarons.
So there you go.
Between us, we were.
To your point, Connor, that was the point where Ipswich ripped it up and went back, and there's some argument that if they hadn't done that, would they have more or less points than they finished with at the end of the season? I'm not saying long term that would have been the right thing, but yeah. I think you were saying though, this week though, this is the week, isn't it? Because if I may, against Borough, so Aaron's now has his place. Christoph Zimmermann starts at centre back. Timu Pukki moves up front. Jordan Rhodes, probably, is he the biggest earner here?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head.
But possibly...
that depends if you're still including players who were here in the Premier League who maybe haven't been involved this season.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But, like we said, the plan appeared to be Rhodes is going to score you the goals. And he's out, and Hanley is done, Pinto is done, Rhodes is done, and Marshall's done. They're not, now I looked for the rest of the season, going to be first team players.
Well, Hanley was injured. And it came out the day before the Middlesbrough game that Grant Hanley was injured, and he was the captain. And I remember turning up for that game, and there was a real sense of, not doom and gloom, that's too strong, but a lot of worry amongst Norwich fans who were thinking, we've not started very well, we've now lost our captain to injury for goodness knows how long. I don't think many fans turned up here for that Middlesbrough game expecting a win, and that's where it all turned.
Absolutely. Let's speak a little bit about that Middlesbrough game then, because it did feel like the turning point. I think after that Ipswich game where, as you say, it was kind of the sliding doors moment, this felt like the moment where Norwich really nailed down their starting 11 and then pushed on, didn't it, I think? And
remember, Borough started well. They weren't conceding any goals at all. I haven't checked it, so fact check me. This is probably their first defeat of note as well. And you just wonder with these things. Pukki gets to go up front and scores. What happened if he hadn't have scored, do you know, in that game? And if we look at the results from then onwards, it's basically to the end of the season now. They're amazing. And
people have forgotten, I think, about that closer red card, and I had until I looked back at some of the notes I made during the game. It wasn't that controversial a decision in the end because it was a second yellow. I think he fouled a Sombalonga, didn't he? And the referee was very quick to get the second yellow, and Closer was on his way off the pitch, and they realised the linesman had actually already flagged for a Sombalonga being offside before the foul was committed. So it was the right decision, but I don't remember very often, if at all, here at Carrow Road, seeing a player walking off the pitch being recalled by everybody. So but when you see things like that happen, it's funny, these little moments in a season, you start to think, I don't know, maybe there is something happening here.
And if we think back at that game, finally, for this part, it's probably one that we look back on and say it was the best performance at this point of the season, because it was the time, as we say, Hanley wasn't fit, and it was the League Cup team, as you say, beginning to sort of make their way into the first team.
It's what we all needed, a win at that point against one of the teams that were really fancied for promotion. To get that here, I think that gave players and fans, it gave everyone a massive boost.
There we go. I think that's just about the end of part one. Thank you very much to Chris and Ben for joining me for that. If you did like it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. Comment your thoughts on that period. Were you one of those who thought Daniel Farke should have left the club? And if so, are you eating your humble pie at the moment? And which, you know, might be enjoyable, might not be, depending on probably the size of your ego, I would imagine. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you for part two very soon.